Hello? I'm fine, I'm fine. Yes, yeah, it started. Yeah, no, we have to wait until 8:15. Uh, you enter, yeah? You entered. But you have to wait until 18:15. She's waiting for students. What? Can you speak up yours? Okay, okay. I didn't finish it. Helen sent me another thing, so when I finish, I will send it. Uh, Bye.
Anju.
Okay, please turn off your microphones. Okay, so we can start. Now our list of attendance is closed. I have to download our list. Give me a second. Okay, and we will start. As you know, I hope you know that I upload to EduPortal presentation from lecture number 2. I will show you on my screen. And we have to move with didactic knowledge. So today we will not read this presentation because also I have very important movie and lecture for you about health promotion. So here you have this PDF here, and you can download this. And please read it yourself at home. It's very important, and also it's very important to make notes. I will show you today a lecture from Stanford about health promotion. And please make notes with details about cardiovascular diseases and how can we prevent CVDs. Okay, here in very short way, I will show you what you have in this presentation that I gave you first, because you have to know the topic of our module now, because now we will talk about on this lecture, on previous lecture, on this lecture, and on the next lecture, we will talk about health promotion, how nurse can be health promoter. Okay, that's the topic of our classes. Give me a second. Okay, so in this presentation, you have information about what we can understand by nurse as an educator, because it's very important role in nursing. Okay, listen. It's very hard to talk if people want to attend to the lecture. Please tell your colleagues that our list is closed. We start at 8. And now someone's closed my presentation. Okay, so again, it's very important role. Nurse as an educator. Do you see this presentation? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So you have again our model for three days. So this day another next lecture, and our lecture number 2 was about nurse as an educator. And now here the main topic of this presentation is education with cardiovascular diseases, okay? And my main materials that I use here for this presentation was knowledge from WHO, World Health Organization, okay? Because for me, it's the most important organization, and I think that we can trust what they said about CVDs, okay? Here you have group of disorders that we can include to cardiovascular diseases. In short way, you can say CVDs, just CVDs. It means cardiovascular diseases. So here you have group of disorders that you can include to this group. Also, you have to remember about risk factors, because if we are talking about education for your patient, it's obvious that your patient will have and can have some risk factors of CVDs, yes? So, for example, you know that your patient has raised blood pressure, glucose, and lipids, and nursing role is educate patient how we can help this patient to make these factors on the normal and low level. Make, for example, normal blood pressure, not raised, lipids, and etc. Okay. Next, here you have some information about the scale and about this, how big is this problem. Because you can see that almost 18 million people die each year from CVDs. Each year. 18 million people. So this problem is very, very huge. As you can see here, in the on the left corner, it's numbers from Europe. Give me a second. Okay, on the left corner, you have information from Europe, and as you can see, 36% of deaths, of all deaths in Europe, are common with cardiovascular disease. Okay, we are going next. Here you have information that over 75% of CVDs deaths occur in low and middle income countries. And these low and middle income countries, they have color orange and red. So as you can see, it's Africa, it's part of Asia, and here America. I will give you 1 minute. You can check this low income and low middle income countries. By low and middle income, you know, you have to understand money, obviously, yes. For example, salaries and money. Okay, what about Kudzai and Ifeoma? Do you see presentation? Ifeoma. I don't know how to spell it. Ifeoma.
Yes,
Do you see this presentation?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Okay, so we are going next. Here again about the money, but here you have numbers that means cost of heart disease. So how many hospitals has to pay, how many money we in taxes have to pay for heart diseases, okay? And you have numbers in billions. So this problem is very, very huge. On the left corner, you can see that in England, CVD causes 1 in 4 deaths, which equates to 1 death every 4 minutes. So you can count how many deaths in England from CVDs we are going to have during this one lecture. 1 death every 4 minutes from CVDs. So I am sure that now you understand how important is education, and health promotion. Here again, you have some facts about risk factors. And the main factors that cause CVDs are tobacco use, unhealthy diet, obesity, physical inactivity, harmful use of alcohol. So you have to know about it because you will use this information for your health promotion program. Why I am talking all the time, I am talking about this health promotion program. Because your task and evaluation work will be make a health promotion program for case study. I will upload to you on your Edu portal case study. Case study is information about some patient, and this patient has problem with obesity, with tobacco use, and another risk factors, okay? And your work, your evaluation work from these lectures will be make a health program for your patient, okay? I will upload everything that you have to know about this evaluation work on the Edu portal after this lecture. Do you understand? So you need this presentation for evaluation work, and also you need very detailed notes from lecture from Stanford that I will play you few minutes. Okay? So next, here you have information about stroke and about heart attack. Again, about risk factors for cardiovascular diseases, here with pictures. And here, very important information about the causes of the causes. So we can talk about tobacco use, we can talk about diet, but other determinations of CVDs include poverty, stress, and hereditary factors. So also we have to know what is the social situation of your patient. Okay, as I said, we will not read it because I uploaded it 1 week ago. So you have information here, for example, about salt reduction is a very famous program from World Health Organization. Also about dietary patterns, also about other local practical actions to reduce salt intake, and another important information. You have everything on our Edu portal, okay? About blood pressure, about hypertension, about drug therapy, and another information. So now I will show you this lecture, and please note and please note very carefully, okay? 1 second. Okay, if someone has problem with your device, you can join to the lecture. Now this list is open. Okay. Okay, so again, make notes because you will have case study and you have to make health promotion program for your case study. I hope you understand me. So we are starting now with this lecture.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is David Marin, and this is Josh Knowles. And this session is about heart disease prevention. So what we planned to do is present some stuff. We have slides that we've prepared. But both of us realize that the real value of a session like this is for you to have a chance to ask questions, and we'll do the best we can to try to answer them. So don't be intimidated by the formal structure. Raise your hand if you have a question as we go along. When we're done, if there's still time remaining, then it'll be pure question and answer. Josh Knowles is assistant professor of medicine at Stanford. He does basic science research on the genetics of heart disease. He's the chief medical advisor to the Familial Hypercholesterolemia Foundation. And Josh is a brilliant guy that I have the pleasure of working with. He will talk about really about the atherosclerotic plaque, which is not the title of his talk. Josh?
Thanks, David. I'll give you that money afterwards for that glowing introduction. So, as David said, we're happy to be here. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. We have been reminded to ask you all to fill out a glowing recommendation of this session after we're all done. And if you have questions that you don't want to raise your hand about or you're shy, then you can write them down and pass them along, and somebody will collect them and deliver them to us. So I'm going to talk about coronary heart disease. That's the disease of the arteries that feed the heart.
Okay, dear students, do you hear everything?
We do, but the video is
Yes,
breaking.
we do.
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. Also, I hope that you know my email. I gave it on the first lecture. So if you have any problems, you can text me on my email, because I don't want to close the screen when another students are listening. Okay. So if you want to say something or if you want to text me, I can't see the chat. So you can text me on my mail, okay?
Can we have the email again, ma'am?
Email again. Okay, I can write it. Here, I hope you see it. It's on the chat.
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Sorry, I can share a link because I have this lecture on my computer. It's not from YouTube or something like that. I have this lecture on my computer, so I can't share a link for the video. If you want, I can try to give you this movie on the Edu portal. What do you think about this? I can try to upload it to the Edu portal.
You can upload it, ma'am. You can upload it.
Okay, okay, I will try. I will try. Okay.
Okay.
So now we are turning to the movie. Wait.
And the reason cardiologists like being in cardiology.
Okay, first I have to I have to turn off microphones. Okay. Oh.
The reason is we'll never be out of a job. Coronary heart disease, coronary artery disease has been the leading cause of death in the United States every year since 1900, with the exception of 1 year. Anybody know what that year might have been? 1918 was the flu pandemic. That's exactly right. And this is a slide that illustrates this. I don't know if you can see this green line, but cardiovascular disease is the worldwide cause of death, was in 1990 and is in 2010. And a very related, stroke is the second leading cause of death, 1990 and 2010. And so this is something that's, pardon the pun, near and dear to all of our hearts. And so we need to think about this in depth. But one thing I also like to point out, just for the general audience, is if you look down here, the 19th leading cause of death was 25 years ago with measles. And there's measles in the press a while ago, last year, and back in 2010, it had dropped all the way to 62. And so we were really hoping, as a sidebar, not to go back to the old days. And coronary heart disease affects everybody in the country, not just not just us in Santa Clara County over here. It's particularly prevalent in some parts of the country, the poorer parts of the country. I grew up in North Carolina, one of the southern states, and you can see that there's this cardiovascular disease concentration in these some of these states, and it causes, as you see down here, almost 400,000 deaths a year are caused in the United States by coronary artery disease, with costs of over $110 billion. So if we could make little inroads into this, it would be very important. Now, everybody cares about coronary heart disease, and this slide is an interesting think slide. It's just something that's a little provocative. And this, I'll just take you through this, but this is web searches. Google categorized all the web searches that were done in the entire country for a year, and they divided this search, this graphical breakdown by what people searched about in the most wealthiest, easiest places to live in the country, and what people searched about in the hardest places to live. And we're living in Santa Clara County, which we're fortunate to live here, beautiful weather. People are doing financially, on average, very well. Median income of Santa Clara County, $90,000. Very low unemployment rate. Life expectancy is high. Contrast that to one of the poorest counties in the country, Breathitt, Kentucky. Median income, $23,000. Life expectancy, 12 years lower. And the number one thing that people searched for in Santa Clara County was golf. This is digital cameras, jogging, holiday greeting cards, and iPad applications. The number one thing that people search for in the hardest places is free diabetic medications, ways to lower blood pressure, diabetic diet, Antichrist, and 38 revolvers. So, heart disease it's important, and it's important not only here, but especially in other places. So what does a heart attack look like? Well, these are pictures that you guys might be familiar with, and I showed this purposefully with a white man over here and an African-American woman here and another woman here, because
Okay, listen, please.
Ma'am, the video just stopped.
Yes, because you still turn on your microphones and the sound is bad, I have to turn off it to turn off your microphones. Please don't turn on microphones. Okay, now you can just communicate with me only with chat. Okay, we are turning back to the video.
the classic is, you have chest pain down your arm or up your jaw, but it can also affect people in different ways. Many times, you guys heard in the last session, women often present in a little bit different way. So this might be how heart attack looks on the outside. And there are some warning signs for heart attack, and some of you have heard of these before: chest discomfort, squeezing pressure, fatigue, shortness of breath, nausea or vomiting, jaw pain, left shoulder and arm pain, back pain, cold sweats, or lightheadedness. So these are some warning signs. And what's actually going on when we say heart attack or myocardial infarction? What's actually happening? Well, this is a graphical representation of what the heart looks like, and these are the arteries that feed the heart. The heart is a muscle, it needs a blood supply, and these are the arteries that feed the heart muscle. And what can happen over time is, in these arteries, plaque, that's this yellow stuff represented here, can develop in these arteries. It can block the arteries, and then in these plaques, there can be little ruptures. These plaques can break, and when they break, it's just like causing like if you cut yourself on the outside of the skin, your body would try to heal that with a blood clot. But if your body tries to heal that cut with a blood clot in the coronary artery, this blood clot forms and it blocks the blood supply to the rest of that territory. And this part of the heart, if the blockage happened here, the rest of this heart would suffer, give you pain, and potentially that heart muscle would die. And that process is illustrated a little bit better here. So when we're born, these arteries are all smooth, and I'll show you some more pictures. And then these clots can develop over time. And if this plaque, say this plaque area right here becomes unstable, it can rupture. And that rupture, again, leads to this blood clot, dead heart muscle here, chest pain, etc. Now, what does that look like for a cardiologist? What does that look like? Well, say somebody came into the emergency room after being brought in by the EMS, the 911, and they were complaining of chest pain. Well, we can diagnose that with ECGs, and we can look at blood tests. And then if we find that somebody is taking a heart attack, our immediate treatment is to whisk them away to what we call the cath lab, the angiography suite, where we can actually take pictures and look at those arteries. I'm just going to show you some movies of what that actually looks like to us. And this is an illustration, and this is an angiography uses X-rays technology, basically. So this is an X-ray, a moving image X-ray. And what you can't see here is the catheter. The catheter is inserted into an artery in the arm or the leg, and it's threaded up around the major blood vessels of the heart to the aorta, and the coronary arteries come off of the aorta. And this catheter is engaging that artery, and we're injecting dye. And what you can see here is the dye is getting stopped right here. There's a big Goomba, that's a medical term, Goomba sitting in this artery, a blood clot that's sitting in this artery blocking the blood flow to the rest of the heart. Now, this would have been universally fatal decades ago, but nowadays, using technology, some of which were invented at Stanford, our interventional colleagues can open that artery by threading a wire through that blood clot and ballooning that open. That's called and then they can put a stent in. So if you've had people, your friends or family members or yourself have had a stent, that's what it looks like. And you can see that blood flow has been restored to the artery. Now, the important thing that we tell patients that have this procedure is that this does not cure your disease. You are not cured when this happens. You have been saved in some ways, but there's disease in the rest of this artery that you just can't see with the naked eye. And our job is really to prevent that rest of that disease from causing problems. And so how do we get from a smooth, pristine-looking artery to something that has caused a heart attack over time? And we've known since the 1980s, or 70s and 60s, and we've been developing ways to understand what's happening. And a lot of this work was based on autopsy studies of young people that died in motor vehicle accidents or actually in combat in Vietnam or previous wars. And what pathologists started to recognize is that the atherosclerotic plaque starts to develop in our teenage years. And then over time, it gets larger and larger and can cause problems later in life. And one of the important things that I like to emphasize is that atherosclerotic plaques develop in the same way in everybody, but at different rates. And so some people, they always start with a little bit of plaque that develops and that gets bigger over time. And I'm going to tell you some of the ways that this happens. And really, these plaques, the disease of the arteries can be thought of as the vessels, the response to an injurious stimuli. So an injurious stimuli include things like high blood pressure or high cholesterol. Those act to injure the blood vessel wall. So one of the first things that happens, and this is a blood vessel wall right here. These are called endothelial cells. They line all the blood vessels, and this right here would be the inside of the blood vessel where all the blood goes. And then this is the muscular part of the blood vessel wall. So this is just a schematic representation. So what happens is the cholesterol particles that you've heard about, high cholesterol LDL particles, can actually get inside the vessel wall. Those can get oxidized and triggers an inflammatory response. The body's own inflammatory cells then migrate into that plaque area to try to combat that or in response to that inflammatory stimulus. And they stimulate a whole growth program. They stimulate more smooth muscle cells. These are smooth muscle cells that grow and divide, and the plaque gets bigger and bigger. And this is the body's way of dealing with this inflammation. And over the short term, maybe it helps, but over the long term, it causes bigger and bigger plaques to develop. Then these plaques, these cells in this plaque start to die. They leave off death products, which again are an inflammation. So it's a vicious cycle. And so what we really want to do is prevent these injurious stimuli from hurting the blood vessel wall. And this is another way of representing that. So this is what our arteries look like when we're born. They're like tubes, and they have lined by these endothelial cells, which are a single layer of cells, so very delicate. They can be scraped off pretty easily. And then there's some muscular parts of the artery that give it its integrity. And then again, over time, early atherosclerotic plaques can develop. Those plaques can get bigger and bigger. More lipids can get inside. This area of blood flow can get obstructed. You can imagine if your heart needs a lot of blood flow, like you're exercising, but you've limited the amount of space that the blood can get through, that might give you chest pain. That's called angina. Or that plaque can rupture and give you a heart attack. And then this process of plaque rupture is probably going on, and healing is probably going on in all of us, to not randomly, but somewhat randomly all the time. Little ones, and the body deals with them, but big ones can cause these heart attacks. And so eventually over time, you can get a much more narrow space. Again, if you have a heart attack, then the heart muscle itself can die. And so what does this look like pathologically? And this is actually sections. This is from an unfortunate young person who died in a motor vehicle accident. This is an artery, and you can see that this is the muscular layer, and then you can't even see the endothelial layer, but it lines it. And over time, from these injurious stimuli, which David will talk about to a great extent, you can get the development of this plaque. And there are some, and this is where the blood flow is now restricted to. And there's some things in here that are pretty interesting. So these little lines here, these are actually cholesterol crystals that have formed in the plaque. There's calcification that happens in this artery over time. If the plaque stays around enough, it gets calcified. And David will talk about why that's important. Dr. Marin will talk about why that's important. You can see that there's these areas of red. Some of these might be areas where the plaque is ruptured and healed. There's lipids in here. There's dead cells. And then this is actually what it looks like to have a clot in the blood, in the plaque itself. So here is a plaque that had been forming in the artery, and it ruptured, and a blood clot formed, and obviously led to this person's demise. So risk factors, what are the injurious risk factors, things that you can and can't control? And some of the things that you can control, obviously, are your diet, your exercise, your weight, your smoking, how you sleep, whether you have a meaningful personal relationship, the stress level that you have. All of these things impact how fast these plaques develop. But there are also things that you can't control. You can't control who your parents were, your genetic history. You can't control your age, your sex, your ethnicity, and obviously your genes. So what we're trying to do is, if you have a predisposition to heart disease based on these risk factors, we're trying to control these risk factors as best we can to mitigate that risk. Another way of thinking about risk factors is, what are the risk factors? What are the big risk factors for heart disease? Well, the biggest risk factor is age, family history, your gender, whether you're a female that's postmenopausal, but all these other risk factors you've heard about: high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, living a sedentary life, smoking, or stress. Again, these are modifiable risk factors, things you can control. These are non-modifiable risk factors. Now, what is the breakdown of how this affects you as an adult? Well, the potential as an adult, once you get to be an adult, lifestyle is probably a bigger contributor to your risk for heart disease than is your genetic background. And the MacArthur Foundation, this is a little bit of a hand-waving breakdown, 80-20, but it for this kind of audience, I think it serves a general purpose, unless you're a person like, there's always exceptions to the rule, so who knows who this is. Now, you guys laugh, but I've given this lecture to many Stanford undergraduates, and when I give this lecture to Stanford undergraduates and I say, who is this guy here, very few know who he is, which is a little bit scary. But, you know, Winston Churchill, he smoked, he drank heavily, he didn't exercise that much. He had a very, very stressful life, obviously. He did have a very meaningful personal relationship. He and his wife were married for decades and decades. But he lived till he was in his 90s. Ultimately, he died after a series of strokes. there are exceptions to the rule. He obviously had good genetics, but in general, these are the kind of things that we need to be doing. The foundation of good health. This is one of my favorite slides. It's a gym. People taking the escalator to the gym. We need to avoid that. We need to convert that. We need to convert that to this. We need to not smoke. And this is not smoking is the biggest reason that we're living longer in the United States over the last 50 years, probably. We need to eat a little less of this and a little bit more of this. We need to know our blood pressure and our cholesterol and have a good weight, maybe moderate alcohol. So that's really the end of what I wanted to say. I think the important thing to remember is if you think you're having a heart attack, remember to call for help, call 911, take a baby aspirin. There's nothing that we hate more than somebody vacillating about this, saying, I'm just going to get over it. If you think that there's a problem, get it checked out because we can do things about it. And that's the end of my talk, and I'm glad to turn it over to Dr. Marin.
Thanks, Josh. So I'm going to speak about how we evaluate people who come to our preventive cardiology clinic. How do we assess risk? And what are the behavioral or lifestyle things that we want to target? And then what are the medications that we use to prevent heart attacks? The term prevention really applies to different phases of, if you will, the disease process. There is a term that is called primordial prevention. It's a nice idea. The term itself has really not caught on very well. You don't hear people talking about primordial prevention, but the idea is to prevent the development of risk factors in the first place. And this is really a public health kind of issue. It has to do with our schools, how we educate families to take care of their kids. But the idea is catching people before they even develop risk factors in the first place. And then there's primary prevention. And this is what we do a lot in our clinic. We see people who have risk factors, and they're the risk factors that Josh mentioned. There's high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking. And what we can do to prevent people who have no symptoms, but they have risk factors from developing disease. And when I say developing disease, I mean heart attack and stroke primarily. And then there's the idea of secondary prevention. These are people who have developed angina, they've had a heart attack, they've had a stroke, and they're alive. And the idea is to try to prevent a recurrence. So there's a spectrum of prevention. For primary prevention, one of the first things we do when we meet someone in the clinic, and this is a little hard to see, I realize, but I have on my smartphone the mobile app for this. This is the web-based application. It's from the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association. And what we do is we plug in a number of variables that you provide to figure out what is your risk over the next 10 years of having a heart attack or stroke. And depending on how old you are, there's also a calculation of what is your lifetime risk of having a heart attack or stroke. Because your risk over the next 10 years might be low, but your risk over a lifetime might be high. So the variables here that we plug in are your sex, age, race or ethnicity, HDL cholesterol, cholesterol, total cholesterol, systolic blood pressure. That's the top number, the first number in the blood pressure measurement. And then whether or not you have diabetes, you're on treatment for hypertension, or if you're a smoker. And then we push a button and a number pops up. And we find out if your risk is less than 5% over the next 10 years, which would be considered low risk. If your risk is 7.5% or higher, which would be intermediate to high risk. And then there's that 5 to 7.5% risk that's really borderline. Yes. The diastolic blood pressure is important, but it's not as important as systolic. We used to think that diastolic blood pressure was the most important blood pressure parameter to follow. And this information comes from Framingham, the Framingham Heart Study. But over time, we've come to learn that it's really the systolic blood pressure that is the main blood pressure variable that we follow. When we lower systolic blood pressure, we lower risk. It's a little hard to target diastolic blood pressure independently of systolic. So for practical purposes, we really target the systolic. Yes. The systolic blood pressure is the top number. Yeah, so the question is, what does it mean if the systolic blood pressure is high? The systolic blood pressure is the pressure inside your arteries during systole, or when the heart is squeezing. And the diastolic pressure is the pressure in the arteries when the heart is relaxed. So does it mean that the heart is working harder? Yes. The heart has to work harder if it's pushing against a higher pressure. This is the pressure in the arteries outside the heart. And generally, if there isn't something called aortic stenosis, or a narrowed aortic valve, the valve that separates the heart from the aorta, the pressure inside the heart is the systolic blood pressure. Yes. Good question. And that is, how can someone have high cholesterol and normal blood pressure? Or vice versa. We see people with high blood pressure and normal cholesterol. And it's because the things that cause high cholesterol and the things that cause high blood pressure are not always the same. Sometimes they are. For example, if someone is very overweight or obese, that is often associated with an abnormality of blood lipids and with high blood pressure and with diabetes. But there are genetic variables that Josh is much better versed in than I that can affect one risk factor and have nothing to do with the other. Josh is nodding his head, so I must have said it right. Okay, and so what are the so-called optimal goals for these risk factors? And this is what that app will say, that application on the mobile phone, that an optimal total cholesterol is about 170 or less, which roughly correlates or corresponds to an LDL cholesterol of about 100. That the optimal HDL cholesterol is around 50. Average HDL for a woman is 55. Average HDL for a man is 45. And we may talk more about HDL and what a confusing thing that is, but it is a marker of risk, whether or not it causes heart disease, which is quite debatable. Optimal systolic blood pressure is 110. And then, of course, it's optimal not to have diabetes or to be a smoker. So what about diet? What are the latest dietary guidelines? And the latest is not that different than what you've been hearing for the last few decades, but it's a diet that's rich in the intake of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, fish, legumes, nuts, and dairy products that are non-fat or low-fat. This is pretty much the Mediterranean diet. It's pretty much what's called the DASH diet, diet against systolic hypertension. I think that's what thank you. Dietary approaches to stopping hypertension. I really should know that. So this gets a little bit at the question of if you have one thing, shouldn't you have another? If you eat a diet that's too high in calories and too high in sugar or too high in saturated fat, it can downstream lead to heart disease. And it can go directly to the development of high blood pressure if there's too much sodium and too many calories. It can lead to high cholesterol and high triglycerides, depending on the composition of the nutrients. Too many calories compared with the number of calories expended in the form of physical activity leads to obesity and diabetes. And all of these things can cause heart disease and stroke. So I talked about what we should promote in the diet. The things to avoid are these 3 S's: saturated fat, sugar, and sodium. Now, where do we get saturated fat? What are the top few sources in our diet in this country? What's that? Red meat, butter, cheese, and what? Fried food. And of course, it would depend on what kind of oil it's fried in. So here's a list of the top 20 or so. And it turns out that regular cheese and pizza, surprisingly, are the top 2 sources. And this has to do with, what are people eating? It doesn't mean that they are necessarily the highest in saturated fat, but whole fat dairy has a lot of saturated fat in it. Grain-based desserts, and what does that mean? Yeah, cookies and cake. Dairy desserts. So there's dairy again. So dairy figures prominently in 3 out of the top 4 here. Surprisingly, red meat is down here with burgers, and then number 9, beef. And just to confuse you, here's reduced fat milk. So let's say it's low-fat milk, say. But if there's a lot of low-fat milk being drunk, and there is some saturated fat in low-fat milk, if you eat enough low-fat milk, it'll show up on one of the top contributors of saturated fat. But basically, it's whole-fat dairy, red meat. Those are the big sources of saturated fat in our diets. Yes. Right. So the question is, yeah. So there's this French paradox about that is French people eat these. You remember Julia Child? Really high fat diets and have a lower rate of heart disease than we do here in the United States. It's complicated. Some of the variables are that people in France walk a lot more than we do here. As you mentioned, they look a lot different because they're less obese. They drink more wine. Could that have something to do with it? That's controversial, but maybe. They eat a lot more fresh vegetables. So is it, and there, actually I should know this, but I'm not sure if we looked at the saturated fat intake, let's say it's similar to what we eat in the US. I think it probably is, the saturated fat intake, but they eat more of the good stuff and they're more physically active. And so there are, this atherosclerotic plaque that you saw, and they eat smaller portions. That's a good point. And they eat them slowly. So getting atherosclerosis is multifactorial, and meaning there are a lot of variables that influence the likelihood of getting atherosclerosis. A high saturated fat diet is one of them. And having healthy things in the diet can sort of counteract some of the bad things in the diet. So that might help explain this observation. Sure. Right. Why is chicken on here? It has to do with the amount of chicken that is eaten. There's some saturated fat in chicken. If you eat a lot of something that has a little saturated fat, it'll contribute to this list. This is so it's starting the right column is the cumulative contribution. This is what contributes to the total amount of saturated fat. So 8.5% of our saturated fat intake comes from regular cheese. When you add pizza, that adds up. This is just a running total. I'm not sure that that's true, but this is just observational data looking at which foods are providing the saturated fat in our diet and what is the rank order. So fried white potatoes on average provide less saturated fat to our diets than regular cheese. Okay. So sugar. How much sugar should we be eating? We probably shouldn't be eating any added sugar at all. There is, of course, naturally occurring sugar in fruits and in vegetables. But sugar is so ubiquitous in our diets. If you put it in teaspoons per day, the limit recommended by the American Heart Association is 6 teaspoons per day for a woman and 9 for a man. And it's not just because men developed the guidelines. It's just because men are bigger than women. So it's kind of a weight-based recommendation. Where do you get sugar? When you read a label, it could look like any of these things. Fructose, lactose, maltose, dextrose, glucose, sucrose, fruit juice concentrate, cane sugar, high fructose corn syrup, which is really omnipresent, and these other sweeteners that you recognize. Yes. Is that recommendation assuming that we have average sugar intake from other sources? This is total from every source. How would you know? You need to become educated. And one way is by coming to an event like this. That's how you would know. Hopefully we're helping to educate. 9 teaspoons. Well, if you just don't eat stuff with sugar in it, then you'd probably meet the recommendations. Yes, sir. Are food labels accurate for determining this? I'm not an expert when it comes to how the FDA determines the micronutrient composition of foods. Unlike perhaps some of the people who were just shaking their heads, I trust, and this is getting kind of political, I trust the government. I know the person who was just named commissioner of the FDA. I trust that his agency will be doing a good job of telling the truth. But what about foods that don't have labels? And those are naturally occurring foods. And in general, you're better off eating foods that don't have a label when it comes to sugar and salt intake. Yes, sir? You know, some food labels, I think, do say added. Some food labels do say added sugars. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes. Right. Good point. It's a little tricky. Like, let's say somebody has diabetes and they're going to eat a little cough drop, and the label says 0 sugar because the manufacturer made it small enough that they don't have to report the sugar content. You can get fooled. Correct. Yeah. How safe or how harmful are sugar substitutes? Is there a safe one? Boy, I'm regretting that I said just ask questions as I go along because I want Josh up here to help answer these questions. I can tell you that it is really fascinating that people who drink sugar-free soft drinks have a higher risk of obesity than people who don't drink sugar substitute. And, you know, you can, what I initially thought is, oh, well, it's just because, you know, they have a weight problem. And so they've gone to these, you know, sugar substitutes. And there's something that they're doing otherwise that's causing it. But it turns out that, and I don't want to name the sugar substitute because I don't know the field well enough, but that some of these agents actually work in the gut to stimulate hormones that may have an adverse effect. So there may be some adverse effect, meaning something that contributes to weight gain from a sugar substitute. I mean, how unfair can the world get? Or bloating? You know, I don't know about gas. That's a separate thing. And but it just goes to show that it's hard to fool Mother Nature. And if you stick to a predominantly plant-based diet and predominantly a natural food, a whole food diet, you're probably going to be safer than if you eat a lot of artificial foods. Now, you can say sugar's natural, and so saturated fat, and so salt. So, moderation comes to mind, but it's complicated. And I can't say that sugar substitutes are completely safe. Salt comes in many foods shown in this Time magazine cover. It's, not in nitrates, in hot dogs, in sauces, ketchup, in sardines, in pizza, cheese. It's all over the place. And whenever there's a package, you'll see how many milligrams of sodium are in it. Anybody have any idea about what the limit should be of your sodium intake? Like you said, we're living in Santa Clara, where people are well educated. Let's just move on. I don't want to talk about stuff you already know. Yes, sir. I'm not sure I understood. Oh, thyroid. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. So as Dr. Knowles was saying, this is for countries that do not put iodine in their salt. So not so in the United States, because we have iodine here added to salt. Okay, well, I can just say that there was a study looking at the prevention of a second heart attack. It was a secondary prevention trial. It's called the Coronary Disease Project. I think that was the name of it. And people were randomized to get thyroid hormone or no thyroid hormone. And the people who got thyroid hormone had higher heart attack rates. So I don't think that giving thyroid hormone reduces the risk of heart disease unless you're hypothyroid. If you have a deficit, if you are deficient in thyroid hormone, then taking thyroid hormone can reduce the risk of heart attacks. Otherwise, getting too much thyroid has been shown in men who have a history of heart attacks to cause heart attacks and death. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah, so what this slide says is that we should limit, for people, to be specific, for people who would benefit from blood pressure lowering, that reduction of sodium in the diet is advised to less than 2,400 milligrams a day, and that further reduction may result in even greater reduction in blood pressure. And that even if you can't get down there, let's say you eat 6,000 milligrams a day, getting down to 5,000 milligrams a day would be helpful. Yes. Okay, I learned something too by coming this morning. Do you have anything you want to? Yeah. Read the label, and that's true. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Can you live without sugar and without salt? You cannot live without salt in your blood, but you can live without salt in your diet. So yes, you can live without added salt. And when I say you can't live without salt in your blood, everybody's got some sodium in their blood. If the sodium level goes really low, it's dangerous. But your kidneys regulate the concentration of sodium, and you don't have to eat salt to preserve the salt content of your blood. And what about sugar? You don't need to eat it. Zero. You don't need to eat cholesterol either. I mean, you don't. Our brains have cholesterol in them. All of our organs have cholesterol. Every cell membrane has cholesterol in it. But we don't need to eat cholesterol. Our livers make it. So because high cholesterol is clearly a cause of atherosclerosis, there's just no debate about this. You know, there's all kinds of conspiracy hypotheses or theories, but high cholesterol causes atherosclerosis. And there's no one better than Josh to go into detail about that during our discussion, if I leave him any time to talk. But you don't need, well, what our dietary guidelines say. Well, I'll tell you a quick history. This is what they used to say. Okay, Time magazine cover, I think 1984. This was after the first major cholesterol-lowering trial showed a benefit in the prevention of heart disease. It was the Lipid Research Clinic's coronary primary prevention trial with a drug that lowered cholesterol. Time magazine interpreted that to being, sorry, no cholesterol in your diet. They changed their tune in 1999, 15 years later, when a large epidemiological study from Harvard showed that among over 100,000 men and women, nurses and physicians were followed for 8 years after they reported their dietary intake. Eating up to 1 egg a day had absolutely no effect on the risk of getting a heart attack, unless you had diabetes, in which case it did. So the melon replaced the bacon, and the idea was you can eat eggs and it's okay. But our dietary guidelines still said limit cholesterol intake to less than 300 milligrams a day. And the new guidelines say available evidence shows no appreciable relationship between consumption of dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol. Serum cholesterol being blood cholesterol. And it's true that when you eat cholesterol, it doesn't have a big impact on your blood concentration of cholesterol. However, if you have diabetes, I would limit your cholesterol intake just because that's the one population subgroup that showed harm from egg consumption. But the bottom line for the new dietary guidelines is it's not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. Myself, I always think that the egg board should have said, go with egg whites. Eat twice as many eggs as you ordinarily would. They would sell so many more eggs. Just throw away the yolks. I eat 9-10 eggs in an omelet, but it's all egg whites. And you know, when I buy, I don't buy a dozen eggs. When I buy eggs, I buy 18 because, you know, I go through them more. Or buy the pasteurized egg white thing. That would be my recommendation. Shifting gears. taking a lot of time. All right. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. So is it a conspiracy with a pharmaceutical company? Why the goalpost keeps changing to lower and lower cholesterol? 25, 30 years ago, I wrote a chapter in Scientific American saying that the optimal total cholesterol would be less than 150. So, well, I had a co-author. Well, we know when we're born, our LDL cholesterol is in a 25 to 50 range. And what's happening to our brains? Is low cholesterol dangerous for our brains? That's when we have the most, the most robust, the fastest development of brains in the setting of very low cholesterol. Is low cholesterol dangerous to the brain? I don't think so. When you look at hunter-gatherer societies that essentially don't get heart disease, their total cholesterol, or let's stick with LDL cholesterol, might be in the 70 to 90 range, corresponding roughly to a total cholesterol in the, say, 150, 135, 150 range. We've known for a long time that lower cholesterol is associated with a lower risk, but it takes a long time to make public health proclamations. And some of us are just more pushing the envelope than others. There's a method to developing guidelines which are based on clinical trial evidence as the best source of evidence. It takes so long and so much money to do clinical trials to show what is the best cholesterol level. So I share your frustration, but I feel somewhat defensive for the people who are just following guidelines. Our guidelines have taken a long time to catch up, I think, with where they should be, and they took a little side trip the last few years that we might talk about because they removed the goal for what our cholesterol levels should be. Oh yes, go ahead. Oh, I showed these pictures because foods that have a lot of cholesterol that we think of are egg yolks and crustaceans, shellfish. They have a lot of cholesterol. But, these things, shrimp and lobster or crab, is that crab or I was thinking lobster? Crab, okay. So they have very low fat. Shrimp and crab and lobster, very, very low in fat. And the fat that's there has some omega-3 fatty acids. So I think of these as high cholesterol foods. You could also think of liver, other organs, as high in cholesterol. That's why they're on the photograph there. Yes, sir. How do you raise HDL? How do you raise HDL without raising LDL? It is a perfect segue for exercise. I'm feeling like I should turn on one of these microphones for you. No? Okay. So your question presupposes that raising HDL is good for you. And that is controversial. the conventional wisdom is raise your HDL, but it's really not clear. People with high HDL tend to have a lower risk of heart disease. They tend to. They also tend to have lower triglycerides. And all the focus has been on HDL as compared with triglycerides, but the action may be more the triglycerides than the HDL. When you look at people who genetically have higher HDLs, they don't tend to have lower rates of heart disease than people who have genetically low levels of HDL. When you look at people who have genetically high levels of triglycerides, they do tend to have higher rates of heart disease. How do you raise HDL? Well, you can take estrogen. I wouldn't recommend it. Weight loss, exercise, anything that lower triglycerides will tend to raise your HDL. Alcohol, any color wine, any variety of alcohol will raise HDL. So beer, hard liquor. So there are, and then there are certain drugs that raise HDL. Among them, niacin. And we used to love to prescribe niacin because it raises HDL, it lowers triglycerides, it lowers LDL cholesterol. And in the era of statins, they have been found to be of no additive benefit. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. There are ways to raise HDL. I would not eat a lot of saturated fat as a method to raise your HDL. However, if you eat a lot of saturated fat, your HDL will go up and your LDL will go up too. Yes, sir. The question is, what about people with extremely high lipoprotein little a, and they're using niacin to bring that down? Let's turn on a mic for you, Josh. Yeah, you should answer that question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We know that lipoprotein A, many people might not have heard of that, but it is now a known causal risk factor for heart disease, just like LDL. And about 20% of the population probably has a high enough lipoprotein A to be worried about it. There are no specific drugs yet available that will just lower lipoprotein A without having other effects. And so nowadays, niacin is used in some people that have very, very elevated lipoprotein A, not because we have great data to support its use, but just because we don't have anything else to offer. And there will be specific drugs to lower LPA coming out soon, but those are just not available. So right now, the European guidelines suggest that we can use niacin for very elevated LPA. The American guidelines don't really say that. So it's sort of it's a little bit of a data-free zone, but I do occasionally offer it to patients that have extremely elevated LPA, especially if they've already had a heart attack or stroke.
And there's a new class of drugs.
Yeah, and there is a new class of drugs, PCSK9 inhibitors. These are injectable cholesterol-lowering drugs. They mostly lower LDL by about 50 or 60%. They also lower LPA modestly, but they're extremely expensive, $15,000 a year, and so have not been approved for people just for LPA lowering. It does show up in your blood test if it's specifically ordered. It's a specific lab test. It doesn't just show up in a routine lipid panel, but it's not routinely ordered. And the reason things are not routinely ordered is if there's no specific treatment for it, then guidelines don't necessarily recommend measuring it. You know, it's interesting. 25 back in 1980, guidelines did not even recommend checking your cholesterol because we knew it was associated with a higher risk, but we didn't have any way of treating it. And so that's one of the reasons that guidelines are always behind. They have to have randomized clinical trial data to support doing things about it. So LPA, I'm sure, will be one of those things that we measure in 10 years routinely. But right now, if you're, we routinely measure it because we think we're ahead of the curve, but it's not always routinely recommended. But I think you should go for exercise. I mean, that's a really, keep moving.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Get back on the hot seat.
Okay. Did you?
Yeah. No, they're very specific for LDL. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Okay. So the question has to do with this ratio that you get on a blood test result. Typically, you get a total cholesterol to HDL ratio. You might get an LDL to HDL ratio. The more popular is the total to HDL. And it's a pretty strong predictor of risk to use the total cholesterol to HDL ratio. It just means that you take the total cholesterol and you divide it by HDL. And a favorable ratio is generally less than 4. It was popularized in the Framingham Heart Study. And when you think about it, the more of the total cholesterol that is comprised of HDL, the better. It means that there's less of the injurious so-called lipoproteins, the LDL and the triglyceride associated lipoproteins. So how do you improve the ratio? Generally, you improve the ratio by lowering the LDL cholesterol, but it could be by raising the HDL. And that ratio is a slightly better predictor of risk than just the LDL. In fact, when we use that risk calculator, we plug in the total and we plug in the HDL. Yes, ma'am. Right. I'm going to get to that. And the question has to do with what do you do for patients who can't take statins because of muscle symptoms? I might get to it, and if I don't, afterwards. All right. So I'll move a little more quickly. Why exercise? It's because exercise, being sedentary, is as strong a risk factor as smoking when it comes to heart disease. So cardiovascular, these are deaths attributable to individual risk factors. So smoking, here you see 50,000, more than maybe 125,000 deaths a year due to smoking. Very similar risk associated with physical inactivity, just to give you an idea of the relative contribution of behaviors to the risk. And in people who have, let's say, high blood pressure or diabetes, smoking, high cholesterol, the more active, shown in the dark bars as the reference, the more active you are, the lower the risk. The less active you are, shown in the light green, the higher the risk, independently of the other risk factors that you have. So if you're obese, BMI greater than 30, you're better off if you exercise even if it doesn't change your weight, your risk of heart disease is reduced by physical activity. How much? Here's a typical encounter in the preventive cardiology clinic. You can probably tell already from my personality. What fits your busy schedule better? Exercising for half an hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? No, we're very sensitive when we meet patients, and we're very nuanced in the message that we give. So how much exercise? It's generally, the general recommendation is go for 30 minutes every day, at least 5 times a week. That's the basic recommendation. That's 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise. Now, for most people, it's walking the dish or the street. You don't need to be an athlete. It helps, but you don't need to be an athlete to get 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. And it adds up. Like, let's say you don't have 30 minutes. Okay, I understand, I'm busy. But you can put together 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes at night. The benefit is cumulative. Some basic facts about physical activity. Half of Americans don't meet this minimal guideline. More than a third report no physical activity at all. Obesity has more than doubled since 1990. Deaths from physical activity will soon be more than the deaths due to smoking. And if you are active 30 minutes a day, it'll reduce your risk of dying by as much as 40%. Yes? Sitting is the new smoking. It's nice. It's catchy. It's true. This circle just says, I'm repeating myself, 50% don't meet the minimal guideline. And in the dark orange bars, these are the percent of people in each age group. Here's 18 to 24, 24 to 44, and so on, who report getting no physical activity. So, yeah, we are becoming an inactive and obese and diabetic nation. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Right. Okay. We got the message. In New York, there aren't a lot of personal cars, a lot more people walking. Yes. Okay. All right. You heard it. We'll do that. And I'll make a few more points and then ask Josh to join me up on the stage. 30 minutes of walking burns about 150 calories. If you walk briskly, 30 minutes maybe is 185 calories, which is a glazed donut. So there are 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. if you want to lose a pound a week of fat, you need to be minus 500 calories per day. Times 7, that's 3,500 calories. When you think about how much physical activity that is, all things being equal with your diet, you would need to, you'd need to add 5 miles of walking a day to achieve that. And you can do that. But it's a lot easier to eat 500 calories less than it is to exercise 500 calories more. Not that you shouldn't exercise, but in terms of weight loss, you really need to deal with the intake. Not that the output isn't very important. Let's talk about statins and then stop. I'll stop. Statins are these drugs like Lipitor, Crestor, Zocor that lower LDL cholesterol very well. And as Josh was mentioning, we've had a lot of clinical trials now in the use of statins. These are for people with a history of a heart attack or some form of heart disease. And these are people who have not. That's a primary prevention trial. And you can see here on the x-axis is the LDL cholesterol during the trial, LDL cholesterol. And this shows what happened to the risk as the cholesterol goes down. This shows, for example, in the 4S trial, people who were on placebo versus people who were on the active treatment. And these studies, bottom line, for people with heart disease, you need to treat 20 people for 5 years to prevent one major event like a heart attack or a heart attack death. And in people without a history of heart disease, you need to treat 55 people for 5 years to prevent a heart attack or a stroke. There are 4 groups that our guidelines recommend as people who would benefit from being on statins. These are people who have a history of stroke or heart attack, or clinical atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is what that is abbreviation. LDL cholesterol greater than 190, really high cholesterol, these people would benefit from being on a statin. For people with, anyone with diabetes would benefit from being on a statin based on these trials that I showed in the previous slide. And then people who don't have diabetes, don't have a history of heart disease, but they have a 7.5% risk or higher of having a heart attack or stroke over the next 10 years based on that calculator that I showed you. Now, why aren't people taking statins according to our guidelines? Because about 40% of people who by these recommendations should be on a statin are not taking statins. Why? And it's because of conspiracy theories. I'm serious. I think it's dangerous what is being propagated in the news and on the internet that discourages people whose lives could be saved by being on a statin. They won't take it because it's a medical industrial complex conspiracy. They're dangerous. There are all kinds of reasons that we hear. And I actually got these slides from Josh, except this slide I think I gave to Josh, is a really interesting study published recently looking at the impact of bad news in the public domain about statins and how that affects people's taking of these drugs and their risk associated with not taking the drug. The bad news is causing deaths from people who would benefit from statins. It gets me riled up because we're all about prevention and we have this incredible therapy to offer and people are refusing it for the wrong reasons. It gets me mad. So, okay, liver failure, that's a popular thing. It's going to injure my liver. My liver's an extremely valuable organ. I don't want to poison it. Well, the risk of getting liver failure from a statin is the same as the risk of getting liver failure from a statin. It's 1 in a million. It ain't going to happen because of the statin. I think it's very difficult to show any injury to the liver from statins. Now, we're not talking about these mild elevation in blood tests. They really happen. There's a mild elevation in about 1 to 3% of people, depending on the dose that you take. Not shown to be dangerous. Rhabdomyolysis is a dangerous thing. It's when there's muscle breakdown and it causes kidney failure. And this has been associated with taking statins. The risk is extremely low. The people who are at risk are predictable based on other medicines that they take. And so your doctor will know about that. And if you recognize that you're having muscle pain, you should report that to your doctor, and the statin can be stopped and another alternative pursued. I mentioned that 1 to 3% of people will have a mild elevation in liver enzymes. This is so unimportant that the FDA stopped recommending monitoring of liver enzymes while you take a statin. You should just get it measured once before you take your first dose. This just says, after looking at a bunch of studies, that there was no significant association between statins and muscle injury in looking at 74,000 subjects in clinical trials. I'm going to skip these slides and say that there are certain statins that are less associated with muscle injury, and those include pravastatin and fluvastatin, that's Pravachol and Lescol. And when we see people who have muscle pain on statins, we often try fluvastatin or pravastatin, or rosuvastatin, which is Crestor, which we might prescribe starting with just once a week, which will still have a benefit, even though the benefit is not as great as if you took it every day. You may be able to take it without any muscle discomfort at all. Coenzyme Q, vitamin D, probably don't hurt, probably don't help. What about dementia? There is no good study showing that statins cause dementia. There are observational studies that most of which show no connection between statins on thinking. 4 actually showed a benefit on thinking. 3 showed no effect. 2 showed an increased risk of basically what we would think of as dementia. But the people enrolled in these observational studies, we're just an observational studies where we don't intervene, we just record what happens, describe what happens. The people in those studies tend to be old and tend to get dementia. But when you have a clinical trial where there's a placebo control group, there's so far, no evidence that statins cause dementia. The last thing, and then I'll stop, is what about statins and diabetes? And there is, unfortunately, a small increased risk of getting high blood sugar or getting diabetes if you go on a statin. That is pretty indisputable. I don't want to go into the details of this just because of time, but suffice it to say that if you treat 255 people over 4 years, 1 case of diabetes will be caused and 5 heart attacks will be prevented. So the benefits far outweigh the risks. And as far as we know, if you stop the statin, your blood sugar will go back down. That hasn't been well demonstrated. The people who are more likely to get this problem are people who have high triglycerides, a high fasting blood sugar, but not quite diabetes to begin with. I think I'll stop there and get off the hot seat and ask Josh to take the hot seat there where just sit in the middle, Josh, where the red microphone is. And I'll join you. Thank you for all your questions as we've gone along.
Wow, David, you took a lot of questions. You were on the hot seat for a while. We're happy. I think we have a few more minutes left. If there are any outstanding issues that are remaining. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Is there any hope of reversing plaque? And yeah, that's the holy grail, inventing some Drano for all the coronary arteries. And so mostly what we do is until very, very recently, there was really no hope for doing that. Mostly what we're doing is trying to prevent plaque from getting bigger and causing problems. It turns out that if we can lower cholesterol and control all other risk factors very, very, very well, for instance, lowering the LDL less than 70 over a prolonged period of time, you can shrink the plaque size by about 1% per year. So it's not Drano, but it's better than nothing. And there's active research programs all over the world to develop the plaque reversal drug. But the benefits of that reversal, that even that modest reversal, are very substantial. So the question is about potassium. If you lower your potassium or level in your diet, would that change your risk of heart disease? And I think that sometimes it's hard to take out the effect.
Okay, I think that in this moment we can end, because now it's session with questions from audience. Now I want to make some summary of heart disease, cardiovascular diseases, and another short movie. It's short, 20 minutes, and I will let you go.
So today we're going to be giving an introduction to cardiovascular disorders. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to start all the way at the beginning with just a general review of the cardiovascular system. And to do that, I'm going to start a place where people don't typically start. I'm going to start all the way from going to the grocery store. So you go to the grocery store, you pick up some food because you're hungry or you need to eat. And then when you're picking up that food, you're picking up a bunch of healthy stuff, right? You're picking up the fruits and the veggies and all that good stuff that you need so that you can live, so that you can thrive and all of that. Now, once you pick that up, you go home, you cook it, maybe you don't cook it, whatever you decide to do, and yes, you eat it. And I had to include this picture because I was looking for a picture of someone eating, and this one was so cute. And I know people would say, oh, that's so sweet. Anyhow, so you eat that food. What is going to happen with that food? Well, of course, it's going to go down your digestive tract. So you have the food that is entering your mouth, and it's going to go down to your esophagus, and then down from your esophagus to your stomach. And once it gets into your stomach, we're going to start to break it down. Your stomach is churning, it's moving, and the muscles are contracting so that you can start breaking apart that food. You're going to have enzymes that are released to start breaking it down even more. And then, of course, from the stomach, it's going to go into your intestines. And one of the things that are happening is, as you're breaking down the nutrients, as you're breaking down the proteins and the carbohydrates and all of this fun stuff that's happening inside your body, the nutrients get absorbed. And the way they get absorbed is they go into your bloodstream. And then your cardiovascular system has the beautiful job of taking those nutrients and circulating them throughout the body. So here we have our heart. And the heart, of course, is going to be beating. And as that heart beats, it's going to send blood to two different places. It's going to send the blood to your lungs, and it's going to send the blood to the rest of your body. And those nutrients that you ate, those nutrients that got absorbed into the cardiovascular system, into the bloodstream, are going to then circulate through the body. it's not just going to circulate the nutrients, but there's also one other important thing that it's going to circulate, and that is oxygen. As I'm saying it, you guys are thinking it along with me. It's going to circulate oxygen because in order for you to get energy, in order for chemical reactions to happen, certain chemical reactions to happen inside your cells, you need to have oxygen to make that energy in the form of ATP, of course, adenosine triphosphate. That's the energy currency of the body. And in order for that to happen, you need to have that oxygen that's circulating. All right, so let's do a review of the path that the blood is traveling through the heart, and then how it gets through the rest of the body. Okay, so the blood that's coming back from the body, it's going to come via these two great vessels here. So we have this one, let's do it in blue, right here, and we have this one right here, and those are your superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, so superior, I'm just going to put S and I for superior and inferior. The one on the top is your superior, the one on the bottom is your inferior. And when the blood comes into the superior and inferior vena cava from the rest of the body, that blood is going to enter your right atrium. Okay, so the blood comes from the body, enters your right atrium. It's gonna then, when the atria contracts, the blood is gonna go from the right atrium to your right ventricle. So I'm gonna put RV. And you'll notice that it's going through this valve. And that valve is going to be your atrioventricular valve. Okay, so that's going to be your right atrioventricular valve. It's called atrioventricular because it's between the atrium and the ventricle. So your right atrioventricular valve. From there, when the ventricles contract, that blood is going to leave your right ventricle and go into your pulmonary arteries. Now, you hear the word pulmonary, you're thinking it's going to your lungs, right? So these are your, over here and over here, that would be your pulmonary arteries. And actually, this first part is called your pulmonary trunk. It's a trunk that branches off into your two arteries, your left and right pulmonary arteries, and that's going to your lungs. If you look over here, you're seeing that happening here. So it's coming up from your right ventricle and going through these pulmonary arteries to go to your lungs. Once it goes to your lungs, what is it going to get from your lungs? It's going to pick up some oxygen. That oxygen is a key component. That oxygen is needed for that energy, for cellular respiration to happen, the chemical reactions that are happening inside the cell so that you can generate ATP, which is that energy. Okay, so from your pulmonary arteries, it's going to the lungs, it's picking up that oxygen, and then it is coming back. And let's do that in blue since it's in red. It's going to come back via your pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins. So it's coming back via your pulmonary veins and it's going to your left ventricle. And from your left atrium, sorry. Let's change that into an A. Sure, you're going to believe that that's an A. And then from your left atrium, it's going to go into your left ventricle. And then from your left ventricle, when that contracts, it is going to go through, it's going to come out here and go into your aorta. And from your aorta, it's going to be pumped out to the body. So we have blood that came in on the right side. It came in without oxygen. It's getting pumped to the lungs. It's going to pick up oxygen, and then it's going to get back to your left side. And then from there, now we know that it has that oxygen. It can then pump be pumped through the rest of the body. So just a few more terms here. Of course, these valves here would be your left. So I'm just going to put LT for left. Atrioventricular valve. This valve here, where it's leaving to go to the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries, that is going to be, I'm going to draw an arrow. I got a bunch of arrows going all over the place, but that is going to be your pulmonary valve. And the one where it's going into the aorta, that of course is going to be, I'm not going to write it here because I'm running out of space. That is going to be your aortic valve. A few other names that you might hear: the atrioventricular valves. On the right side, we can call this one the tricuspid valve. I should have done that in red. And on this side, we're going to call this the bicuspid or mitral valve. So bicuspid or mitral. On the right side, it is tricuspid. Okay. And then some more terms. This is just, nomenclature. I want you to know these names. I want you to get used to them. The reason this is called tricuspid is because you actually have 3 of these cusps. You're only seeing 2 because this is a cut through the heart, but there are actually 3 of these. And on this side, we have 2 of them. And then the pulmonary and aortic valves, another name for those would be your semilunar. That's a terrible R. Semilunar valves. You guys are going to have to forgive me for this terrible handwriting, but you get the content, you get the point. That's what matters. That's the important part. All right, so let's continue on from there. Now, we spoke about the fact that the right side of the heart, that is going to be pumping the blood to the lungs, right? And I want to get a picture of how that's happening. So here we have our lungs. You have your lungs, you have your bronchi, your trachea and your bronchi that are going to your lungs. And of course, in here, what's happening is you're breathing in. When you take that deep breath or a shallow breath, whatever breath you take, you have air that's coming in, and that air is going to have oxygen. And as we look at the little branches of the bronchi and the little segments of the lungs, we're going to see that we're going to have these little structures that we call alveoli. So I'm going to write here, alveoli. Okay, so these little sacs that you see here, those are called alveoli. And the important thing is that, yes, we said that the blood was leaving the right side of the heart and going to the lungs, and there are going to be a bunch of branching of those arteries. Eventually, you're going to see that we have this blue vessel that's coming in here, and eventually we're going to get all these little capillaries. And those capillaries, that is where air is coming into the lungs, it's coming into these alveoli, and the oxygen is going into those capillaries. So you're seeing here, this is showing you blue because it's deoxygenated. It doesn't have any oxygen in it. But once it gets to the alveoli and you're breathing in, oxygen is in those alveoli, you're going to get a respiratory exchange, oxygen going into the blood supply, and then carbon dioxide coming from the blood supply into your lungs, into the alveoli, and you breathe that out. So there's exchange that's happening right here that makes it so that when the blood comes back to your heart on the left side, now we have oxygen. All right, hope you guys are still following me. This should be a review, or, if you're just getting into the cardiovascular system, this might be a little new for you, but I hope you got kind of a good overview. Now, there's something else that we have to mention when we're talking about this, especially as we're going into talking about disorders. And that is what is happening once the blood is leaving the heart and it's going to the rest of the body. We're going to have arteries. And I'm going to draw this over here. So we have, let's say we have, let's do that in red. We have arteries that are coming down. The arteries that are coming down are then going to give off these little tiny branches and those little tiny branches are your capillaries. Okay, so I'm doing this very raw, and I'm doing it red because this is coming away from your heart. It's oxygenated. Now let's do the other half in blue. The capillaries are going to continue on. And as the capillaries continue on, they're going to go to your little venules and then to your veins. And by the time they reach over here, they are deoxygenated. So we're going to give some terms here. Here we have let's do that in red, artery. On one end, on the other end, we have, oh man, I just messed it up. Oh, what's going on here? Sorry about that. Let's go back to where we were. Okay, quick drawing. This one is not going to be as neat, even though the other one wasn't neat. It's going to be really rough. Okay, coming off on this side. You get the point, what's going on there. And now okay, so let's try that again. Here we have our artery. Over here we have our vein. Here we have an arteriole. And here it's like a tiny artery, right? And here we have a venule. Okay, and then all of this in between here, that would be our capillaries. All right, so when the blood is leaving the heart, it is going to go to your arteries. From the arteries, it's going to your arterioles. From the arterioles, it's going to your capillaries. From your capillaries, it's going to your venules. And from your venules, it's going to the vein. And the main thing that I want you to notice here is that it's going from red to blue. And the reason it's going from red to blue is because as the capillaries are circulating through all of the tissues, the capillaries are giving up, the blood is giving up oxygen. It's giving oxygen to the tissues. And that's what we're illustrating here. So here we have one capillary. We're taking all of this stuff here. We have one capillary. Just for simplification, we're going to have blood. You can see the red blood cells circulating. And the key thing here, I'm not going to talk too much about hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure now. I'll get into that in a later one of these sessions. The key thing is that oxygen is being deposited. We have.
Okay, I will try to upload this movie too to the Edu portal because our time is we should finish. I hope that you enjoyed this time with this knowledge about cardiovascular diseases. And I think that after this May weekend, I will upload for you this task. So that I said, task is about, and this evaluation work is about case study. So I will give you a case study, and you have to do some health promotion program for this patient, for this case study. Okay? Thank you for today. Thank you that you enjoyed this lecture, and we will see at the next week, I think.